So last class we reviewed Atkinson and Shiffrin's modal model of memory, which you can see on the slide here. And the central idea is that there are three memory stores: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. And control processes such as attention and rehearsal move information between these memory stores. Now today we're going to discuss working memory, which is basically a modification of short-term memory. And short-term memory was modified because the version presented in this model is just a bit too narrow. It doesn't allow for us to do multiple things at the same time. So in 1974, Badley and Hitch proposed that short-term memory should be called working memory. And the idea here is that working memory is a limited capacity system for the temporary storage and manipulation of information for comprehension, learning, and reasoning. And so working memory allows us to do things like multiply 43 by 6 in our heads, right? And to do that, you might, verbally walk through the multiplication. So, you might say, okay, so 43 over 6, 6 times 3 is 18, carry the 1, 6 times 4 is 24, plus 1 is 25, boom, 258. Or you might visualize, right, 40 times 6 plus 6 times 3, 258. So there are multiple ways you can do this, but the point is that you're manipulating information in your head, both visually and possibly using phonology, using speech sounds, using language. So here's another example. I'm going to have you remember these four numbers, 7149. And remember them as I read to you a passage of text, and I want you to try to also understand the passage while remembering these numbers. So here we go, 7149. To Yossarian, the idea of pennants as prizes was absurd. No money went with them, no class privileges. Like Olympic medals and tennis trophies, all they signified was that the owner had done something of no benefit to anyone more capably than everyone else. So what were the numbers? Hopefully everybody remembers 7149. And that passage, if you're curious, is from the novel Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, which if you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's hilarious. So the point of that demo was that under the original conceptualization of short-term memory, you couldn't do those two things at the same time. You couldn't remember that number, 7149, and listen to that passage of text or read that passage of text. So we need a model of short-term memory that's more dynamic. Dynamic just means more flexible, more changeable. And so we come to working memory. And so working memory accounts for the dynamics of cognition, right? The ability to understand language and do math problems, and the observation that we can do multiple things at the same time. Although as we learned in the lectures on attention, we're not necessarily good at multitasking, but there are some things that we can do simultaneously, like walk and talk on the phone, for instance. And so working memory, as conceptualized by Badley, has these sort of three components to it. The phonological loop, which consists of essentially verbal information that you can think about using speech sounds. Phonology simply refers to the sounds of speech, and so we all have this internal monologue, right? If somebody tells you their phone number and you don't have a pen or a pad of paper to write it down, or your own phone to type it into, you can repeat that information over and over again in your head. Second key component of working memory is the visual spatial sketch pad. And this is a component that allows you to manipulate information visually. And so in combination, right, the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketch pad allow you to do something like drive a car while receiving directions from a friend. And we've all been in that situation, right? Where you're in your car and your friend is telling you where to turn. Another example would be, walking and talking to somebody else. You're visually navigating your world using your visual spatial sketchpad, but you're also using your phonological loop to have that conversation and understand what you're being told. And between these two processes, we have what's called the central executive. And if we think of working memory as a resource, what the central executive is doing is it's simply allocating processing power to either the phonological loop or the visual spatial sketchpad, depending on, the situation. Right? So when you're writing a really intense exam, you're largely using your phonological loop. You're manipulating information verbally in your head, writing things down, reading. If you're driving, in intense winter conditions, like in a snowstorm, you're mostly using your visual spatial sketchpad. But there are many situations when we're doing both things at the same time. And the central executive allocates resources between these two systems. So what evidence do we have that a phonological loop actually exists? So there are a few different pieces of evidence. The first is known as the phonological similarity effect. So we tend to confuse letters or words that sound similar even if we're reading them on the printed page, right? So F and S and X look very different visually, but they all kind of have the same speech sounds. Phonologically, they sound similar, and because of that, we tend to swap these letters in our mind. Second piece of evidence is known as the word length effect. Memory for lists of words is better for shorter words than longer words. And what that suggests, right, is that for lists that have shorter words, there's just less phonology. There's fewer, I should say, speech sounds to remember, right? And so for lists with longer words, there's more phonology, more speech sounds to remember. And so they're necessarily sort of harder to remember because we're verbally producing the words in our head, using phonology, using speech. And if words are longer, they take more time to produce. So that's known as the word length effect. And finally, we have articulatory suppression. And this is one that most of us have experienced. So think about that situation where, you're in the library trying to read and some annoying jerk 2 cubicles over is, trying to discreetly have a conversation on their phone, right? And so this speech that you're hearing disrupts your own ability to process the words you're trying to read on the page. And this is known as articulatory suppression. And we can give you a demo of this. If you repeat speech sounds over and over in your mind, this actually interferes with verbal working memory. And so here's an example. If I ask you to read the following list of words and remember them, you'll probably be pretty good at this task. So here we go. Please read the following list of words and remember them. All right, recall as many words as you can. And so the words were dishwasher, hummingbird, engineering, hospital, homelessness, and reasoning. So most people probably got, 4 or 5 out of the 6. So let's do the same task, and I just want you to repeat the word word in your head over and over again while you're trying to read the list that you see in front of you. So just repeat word inside your brain. Here we go. recall as many words as you can. And you probably found that it was very difficult to actually read any of the words that you saw while repeating a word, the word in your head. Right? So that's known as articulatory suppression. You need that phonological loop to read words on the page and understand them. And so the words that you saw were automobile, apartment, basketball, mathematics, gymnasium, and Catholicism. What evidence do we have for the existence of a visual spatial sketchpad? So we've seen some evidence for the existence of a phonological loop. What evidence do we have for the existence of a separate system that manipulates information visually in our brains? Well, one piece of evidence comes from mental rotation tasks. And so in these tasks, we're shown two objects like those on the screen, and we're asked, are they the same or different? And so how do you solve this problem? Well, most people mentally rotate the objects to see if they line up. So are these two objects the same or different? In this case, it's pretty easy to tell that they're the same because the amount of rotation is actually quite small. It's only about 40 degrees to line them up. This one's a bit trickier. Are these two objects the same or different? And hopefully you've decided that they are the same. Now, why was this second case harder? Why was it harder? Why did it take you longer? It took you longer because the degree of rotation to line the objects up was actually much larger. It was about 140 degrees versus 40 degrees in the last example, right? So this suggests that the fact that it takes us longer in the second case suggests that we actually are mentally imagining these objects rotating. And this result was first demonstrated in the 1970s by Shepard and Metzler, a very famous study in cognitive psychology, simply showing that, as you increase the angular difference between two objects in this type of mental rotation task, so you ask people, are the objects the same or different? And they have to rotate them mentally to match them up to see if they're the same or different. As you increase the angular difference between the objects, it takes people longer to come up with an answer. Reaction times increase, and the relationship is linear. It's like a straight line. So that really suggests that we're actually mentally visualizing the image and rotating it, and larger rotations take longer. So pretty strong evidence here for the existence of a visual spatial sketchpad that allows us to manipulate information visually. So in Baddeley's original conceptualization of working memory, he only included the central executive, the phonological loop, and the visual spatial sketchpad. Newer conceptualizations of working memory, if you remember, for instance, from intro psych, there's a fourth box known as the episodic buffer. And what the episodic buffer accounts for is chunking, right? We can increase our working memory capacity by grouping bits and pieces of information together, by giving information context. And we saw this in the last lecture. A bunch of random things on their own are hard to remember, but if we can group them together, if we can give them some context, we can actually expand the size of our working memory. And so in newer conceptualizations of working memory, we have this episodic buffer, and that's effectively what it's doing. It's casting our experiences into stories or episodes. and this makes them easier to remember. And again, the central executive is sort of the coordinating system, the conductor that's deciding how much resource goes to each of these boxes, each of these components of working memory. So where's sort of the locus of working memory in the brain? Well, Badley envisions that the central executive is based in the prefrontal cortex. So frontal lobe at the very sort of front of the brain. This area is associated with a lot of the things that sort of make us human, like personality, for instance, decision-making. You may remember that the case of Phineas Gage, right, had that tamping rod blown through his prefrontal cortex. His personality dramatically changed. Could argue that some of his deficits were possibly deficits in what we call cognitive control, right? Inhibiting behaviors that we would normally inhibit. A lot of our psychology relates to just like not saying dumb stuff, stopping ourselves from saying dumb stuff. Like I almost said dumb shit there, and I was like, oh, that would be not something I want to say on a video recording. And then I stopped myself, but then I just said it anyways. And so the prefrontal cortex is involved in that. It's involved in a bunch of different processes. We think it's the seat of working memory, and that it seems to mediate how much of this resource we allocate to the phonological loop or the visual spatial sketchpad. And so we can look at what happens if the prefrontal cortex is damaged. And a lot of this work has been done in animal models, so in monkeys, using what's called a delayed response task. Very simple task. The animal is shown two food wells. And the way food wells work is that they're literally like cutouts, like wells in like a table. You put food in one of them, and you simply then cover up the wells, and the animal simply has to remember that the food was in the one on the left. So in this task, that's exactly what happens, right? Monkeys observe which well contains the food. The wells are covered up. There's a delay period where actually the monkey can't see the food wells at all, and then the screen is lifted up and the monkey can respond at this point. And the idea here is that it has to remember that the food is in the well on the left. And normal, healthy monkeys can do this no problem. And presumably, right, what's happening is that during this delay, the animal is using its working memory to remember that the food is on the well on the left. So in its brain, it's not using language, but it's remembering, food is on the left, food is on the left, food is on the left. Probably visually in this case, because monkeys don't have language. But if we damage the prefrontal cortex, these animals can't do this task at all. So they can't keep that information in mind where the food is during the delay. They respond at chance levels. They pick randomly, basically. So that's some, direct causal evidence, right, that the prefrontal cortex is involved in working memory. If we damage it in animal models, they basically lose working memory. We can record from neurons in prefrontal cortex during this delayed response task, and that's what happened in the study, which was run in the 1980s by Funahashi. And so the idea here is that we have electrodes implanted in prefrontal cortex, probably recording from a group of electrodes, and very simple task. So it's a delayed response task. It doesn't involve food, though. So the idea here is that the monkey's staring at a fixation cross. a square appears somewhere on a screen, the monkey has to remember where that square appeared. So the square disappears, and during a delay period, the monkey has to remember that the square appeared in the top left-hand corner of the screen. And then once the delay period is over, the monkey can actually move its eyes to the location of where the square appeared. And if it moves its eyes to the right location, it gets some sort of food reward. So just a different version of the delayed response task that we just saw. Again, the idea here is that the animal has to keep in mind some information through a delay period, right? And presumably it's using working memory to remember that, oh, the square was on the left, the square was on the left, the square was on the left. And so if we record from prefrontal cortex neurons during this task, we see that during that delay period, they fire like crazy. And it's like the neurons are keeping that information in mind by this sustained neural firing. Once the delay period is over, and the monkey makes the eye movement to the correct location, the firing completely goes away. So these prefrontal cortex neurons fire throughout this delay period. And sort of more evidence, in this case, correlational evidence, that the prefrontal cortex is highly involved in working memory, if not, the seat of working memory. And so here's a demo of how this task works. So the animal is fixating on the cross. And the key here is that you can't move your eyes when you see the square appear. You just have to remember, still fixating on the cross, you have to remember where the square appeared. And once the square disappears, you can move your eyes to that location. So here we go. So keep your eyes fixated on the cross. Okay, now you can move your eyes to where the square appeared. And hopefully everybody is looking at the blue square. And so during that delay, right, the prefrontal cortex neurons in your brain were firing, basically remembering the location of that blue square in the workspace. And so tasks like this really suggest that information is held in working memory by, the sustained firing of neurons in the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so we're going to end the lecture by talking about working memory and performance. Working memory is probably the best predictor of things like IQ, reading comprehension, scores on standardized tests like the SAT and the GRE, grades in university. And so if you have an outstanding working memory, it's highly likely that you do well at these things. And so why? Why is that? What does working memory allow us to do? What is it? What's the benefit of having a really great working memory? So one idea is that having a great working memory means that our central executives are really good at allocating working memory resources to the correct task. So we're really good at focusing and dealing with the task at hand and ignoring distractions. And there's some evidence that that is indeed the case. So this was kind of a complex study run by Vogel and colleagues in 2005. Complex in that it contained both a neural measurement using electroencephalography, so EEG, in this case, event-related potentials, and it also included a change detection task. And there were several different conditions. And so the idea in the behavioral task is that participants viewed a display, an arrangement of objects. There was a delay period, and then a test display, and they had to indicate whether something was changed. So we've seen these change detection tasks before, right? And in this case here, they're told to monitor specifically the red bars on the left. And that's what this arrow, the Q, tells them to monitor, to think about. And so there was a condition where they had to remember the location of 2 red bars and indicate whether they changed. There was a condition where they had to remember the location of 4 red bars and indicate whether they changed. And there was also a condition where they had to remember the location of 2 red bars amongst distractors, so amongst blue bars. And so in this case with distractors, right, you kind of have to do 2 things. You have to remember, the orientation of the red bars on the screen throughout the delay period. And you have to ignore the distractors. You have to basically, not think about, not look at, not attend to the blue bars. And what they did in this task was they measured the electrical activity of the brain while participants were performing the task. So here's how the task works. So you want to ignore the blue bars. So this is the version with distractors. So you want to pay attention to the red bars that are on the left and ignore the blue bars. And you'll see a display of bars, and you have to remember the orientation of the bars, and then there'll be a delay period, and then you have to indicate whether any of the orientations have changed. So here we go. Fixate on the cross. Same or different. And so you should have been paying attention to these 2 red bars up here. And hopefully you noticed the change. So there actually was a little bit of a change. The orientation of this red bar here was changed ever so slightly. And so again, in this version of the task, right, you're doing 2 things. You're remembering the orientation of the red bars. You're also ignoring the blue bars, the distractors on the screen. So let's do this again. Another version of the task, there were 4 red bars that you have to remember. So this is that version. And in this case, you have to remember the bars on the right. Okay, so here we go. Focus on the cross. Okay, same or different from the display that was just flashed at you. And hopefully everybody says the same. So no change in the red bars on the right. And no distractors in this case, but you have to remember more items, right? 4 items here instead of 2. So let's look at the data. And so what they're doing here is they're measuring the evoked response from the brain at the onset of each trial. And when we're measuring the evoked response during working memory tasks, we see just like in those animals where we record from their prefrontal cortex, we see this sustained firing, sustained activity from the front of the brain as measured with EEG. And so that's what we're seeing here, a sustained pattern of firing throughout that delay period. So what's interesting, though, is that they grouped participants into those with a high working memory capacity and those with a low working memory capacity. How do they measure working memory capacity? They just used a change detection task, a very simple one, not as complex as the one we just did, just remembering the location of items on the screen and then indicating whether they changed or not. And so what they found, right, and so we have to look at sort of the details of the evoked response to really understand the study, and it's kind of complex. But let's look at the legend down here. So we're seeing the evoked response, the neural response from the prefrontal cortex during the delay period. In the case where participants had to remember 2 items, that's the black line, 4 items, that's the blue line, and 2 items with distractors, that's the red line. Okay, so let's look at people who have a high working memory capacity. So the black line represents neural firing, presumably from prefrontal areas, while they're remembering these 2 items. The red line represents neural firing while they're remembering 2 items with 2 distractors. And the key here is that the red line and the black line look very similar. So even though there are distractors there, it's not really causing an increase in neural firing relating to working memory. They're doing a pretty good job at ignoring those distractors. The blue line here represents neural firing in relation to remembering 4 items. And we see more neural firing, right? They have to remember more things, makes sense, more activity in their brain. So these are the participants with high working memory capacity. Let's look at the participants with low working memory capacity. And you'll see a very different pattern of neural activity here. So the black line again reflects having to remember 2 items. The red line reflects having to remember 2 items with 2 distractors, and the blue line reflects having to remember 4 items. You'll notice that in this plot, the red line and the blue lines are identical. Whereas in the other plot, the red line and the black line are identical. So what's happening here? Well, in the people who have low working memory capacity, they're having a hard time ignoring those distractors. And so their neural activity for the task that involves remembering 2 items with 2 distractors is the same as their neural activity for the task that involves remembering 4 items. So they're having a really hard time just ignoring those distractors. Whereas the people with the high working memory capacity seem to have a pretty easy time ignoring those distractors. Very cool finding. And so what it suggests is that participants with high visual working memory were really good at ignoring distractions. That's demonstrated in the evoked response from their brains. Very, very cool finding. And so what this suggests, and I mean this is just one piece of evidence, but the reason why we see that people who have high working memories tend to have high IQs, tend to do well in school and on standardized tests, is that they're just really good at ignoring things that don't matter and focusing on the task at hand. All right, that brings us to the end of the lecture. What are the 4 components of working memory? What are the 4 components of working memory? So we have the phonological loop, the visual spatial sketchpad, the episodic buffer, and the central executive. Question 2. What evidence do we have for the existence of the phonological loop? So there are 3 things. Do you remember what they're called? What evidence do we have for the existence of the phonological loop? It's the phonological similarity effect. So we tend to confuse letters that sound the same phonologically as opposed to letters that look the same. There's the word length effect. It's easier to remember lists of words if the words are shorter because we have to remember less phonology. And there's articulatory suppression. It's hard to read or do anything that involves the phonological loop if you're hearing other speech sounds in the room or you're repeating a speech sound in your head. Question 3, what evidence do we have for the existence of a visual spatial sketchpad? Question 3, what evidence do we have for the existence of a visual spatial sketchpad? Very cool study, right? Mental rotation takes longer the more an object needs to be mentally rotated. And this relationship is linear as the angle of rotation increases to match up two objects, it takes you longer to do that task. And so this suggests that you're actually mentally rotating objects in your head to match objects of different shapes.